In this video, we'll take a fundamental look at incorporating state in a function component using the hooks API. We'll specifically investigate the useState function to incorporate state in an otherwise stateless function component. So let's begin. In the last video, we learned about state and how you can create and manage state in class components. Class components offer built-in state management and are thus a natural choice when your component incorporates local state from the get-go. On the other hand, we have function components. Function components are inherently stateless. They accept their data using props and do not offer either state management or lifecycle methods. This is how a function component looks like. As the name implies, these are standard JavaScript functions which accept a single prop argument and return back a React element to render. These are thus lightweight and simple functions that rely on props for their data. There are times, however, when you might need to upgrade your function component to incorporate state. This can happen due to several reasons. For instance, you might want to turn a component that displays a status using a prop into a component that allows you to switch the status. Traditionally, this would have involved refactoring the function component to a class component so that local state may be used. Refactoring code, that sounds like a simple idea, but I'm sure you'll agree it isn't as straightforward in practice. This is why React 16.8 introduced the hooks API. Using hooks, you can easily incorporate state in your function component. This means you don't have to refactor the entire component and you can still incorporate the wonders of state. Let's look at an example where we'll convert a standard function component into a stateful component using hooks. First up, as always, download and extract the project archive from the link given on the screen and install dependencies using npm install. Then run npm start to bring up the development server. Our little demo application contains a class component called app at the top, where we have a state property called code. The purpose of this app is to let the user type out a product code which may be used during an inventory or logging workflow. This code is displayed in the div right here, and we are using a function component called code input which lets the user type in a code value which we get using the onSet prop. When we type something in the box, it's set to the state in the app component and it displays in the product code div as well. The code input component is fairly simple. We have an input box and an onChange event listener that runs when you type something in, and when that happens, it invokes a function passed in using the onSet prop to send up the value to the parent component. This works well, but what if we want to give the user the ability to generate random product codes at the click of a button? I'll begin by adding a button labeled generate like so. We would now need a way to generate a random code, set it to the input field here, and send up to the parent using the onSet function prop. This is where a local state variable would come in handy. The generate button can run a function that can create a code for us, and we can use a state property to sync this value to our input field here. We'll thus use the hooks API. First up, I'll bring in the useState method from the React library. When the useState function is invoked, it returns an array that contains two items, a state property and a function that can be used to set the value of the state property. So we'll use the array destructuring syntax to create a state property called code and a function named setCode which can be used to set the value of the code property. Once I have this, I'll first bind the value property of the input field to the code property that we've just created. This will allow us to keep the contents of the input field in sync with the code property. Next, I'll create a method onSetCode which takes in a value and runs the setCode method to update the state. This function also uses the onSetProp function to send the value up to the parent component. Now when the user types something in the input field, we can run the onSetCode function instead passing in the value of the input field, which then sets the local state property named code, which is what our input field is bound to. This ensures that our input field is in perfect harmony with the state. And because the onSetCode function also invokes our onSetProp, the value is sent back to the parent and everything works as it was earlier. The real advantage that we get with this setup is that we can now use an on-click listener on the generate button to run a function where we can invoke the onSetCode method and set a value. You can see our button in action. The presence of local state thus makes it easy for us to establish a single source of truth for the value of the input field and use the state to set the value. Now, instead of hard coding a number, I'll create a simple inline function that generates a random number like so. And if you hit the generate button now, you can see we are getting random numbers in the input field and they are being received by the parent component. Alternatively, you can still manually type or edit the contents of the input field if needed. Wasn't that interesting? The code input component was simply upgraded to incorporate state using the useState method from the Hooks API. And by the way, the code input component is also a great example of a reusable component. You can use multiple instances of this component and they will all work in perfect isolation because every instance of a component maintains a local and private state. Hooks are simple to understand, which is why you might end up writing a lot more function components with hooks than class components in your projects. And that is perfectly fine. React does not enforce or express a strong opinion on the type of components that you should build. Ultimately, picking between function and class components depends on the objective of the component. If your component uses state, lifecycle methods and more from the get-go, then you're probably good building a class component. However, if you would like to start simple and gradually add state and lifecycle methods as the component evolves, function components with hooks are the way to go. The Hooks API is purely optional and can be plugged in when needed. This is incredible because you can seamlessly incorporate state and other features when needed without making future-proof design and architecture choices from day one. Let's now focus our attention on these little inlets we call props in the next video.